For nearly 50 years, Benny Andersson kept one secret locked away. The man who wrote some of the world's biggest hits, Dancing Queen, Mamma Mia, Waterloo, never spoke about it publicly. But at 78 years old, sitting down for a rare interview, he finally decided the world needed to know. What he revealed shocked even the most devoted ABBA fans. It wasn't just about the music. It was about a relationship that shaped everything he created. And it changes how you'll listen to ABBA forever. For decades, music journalists asked Benny Andersson everything. They wanted to know about his songwriting process. They asked about Agnetha. They asked about Frida. They asked about the tensions backstage. But there was one question nobody ever dared to ask directly. And Benny noticed. He noticed a hesitation in their voices. He saw them lean forward, then pull back. He knew what they wanted to know, but he never gave them the answer. ABBA was the biggest band in the world. For Swedish musicians who sold over 400 million records, they dominated the 1970s like no other group. Their music played in homes across every continent. Families danced to their songs. Children grew up singing their melodies. But behind the glitter and the matching outfits, behind the sold-out stadiums and the screaming fans, there was something else. Something that Benny carried with him silently for nearly 5 decades. The music industry thrived on gossip. Every breakup became a scandal. Every conflict became a headline. Yet somehow, the secret remained protected. It wasn't hidden because it was shameful. It wasn't hidden because it was wrong. It was hidden because Benny made a choice. A deliberate choice to keep something private in a world that demands exposure. But why would a man who wrote The Winner Takes It All, a song so raw it made millions cry, choose silence about his own life? When ABBA formed in 1972, nobody predicted what would happen next. Benny Andersson and Björn Ulvaeus had already written songs together. They tasted minor success. But when they brought in 2 female vocalists, Agnetha Faltskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad, something electric ignited. The chemistry was undeniable. Their voices blended like they were meant to find each other. Within months, they won the Eurovision Song Contest with Waterloo. Suddenly, the world was listening. What followed was a phenomenon that only a handful of bands have ever experienced. Dancing Queen became a global anthem. Mamma Mia topped charts everywhere. Gimme, Gimme, Gimme had people dancing in discos from Stockholm to Sydney. They weren't just making music. They were creating the soundtrack to an entire generation's lives. Teenagers played their albums obsessively. Parents secretly loved their songs. Even rock critics, who usually dismiss pop music as disposable, had to admit ABBA was undeniably brilliant. But success at that level comes with a price. The touring schedule was relentless. They performed on television, shows watched by hundreds of millions. The pressure to create hit after hit never stopped. And within the band, relationships were fracturing. Benny was married to Frida. Björn was married to Agnetha. 2 couples forced together in close quarters, traveling the world, performing night after night. By the mid-1970s, something else was happening too. Something that nobody talked about openly. Something that would eventually become the unspoken tension running through their greatest songs. The band members were living through personal upheaval that few people understood. Divorces were happening. Relationships were dissolving. Yet somehow, they kept creating masterpieces. How does a band stay together creatively when everything around them is falling apart personally? How do they channel that pain into art that moves millions? And what happens when one person carries a secret that could reshape how everyone understands that art? The truth that Benny Andersson finally confirmed at 78 wasn't about infidelity. It wasn't about scandal in the traditional sense. It was about a relationship that existed in the shadows of ABBA's story, one that shaped his creative output in ways fans never realized. For years, Benny had maintained a close connection with someone outside the band. Not a romantic relationship in the conventional way people imagined, but something deeper. Something that influenced his songwriting, his emotional state, and ultimately, the music itself. This relationship existed during ABBA's peak years. While performing Super Trooper and Arrival, while writing some of their most introspective songs, Benny was emotionally invested in someone who wasn't part of the official ABBA narrative. The Swedish media had glimpsed fragments of this over the years. Paparazzi caught moments. Gossip columns whispered. But Benny never confirmed anything. He compartmentalized his life ruthlessly. What made this relationship significant wasn't just that it existed. It was what it represented. It was a connection that offered him escape from the intensity of being an ABBA. It was emotional sustenance during a period when his marriage to Frida was deteriorating. It was companionship that the public knew nothing about. And it was a source of profound vulnerability that he poured into his greatest compositions. Some of ABBA's most haunting lyrics came from this period. The Winner Takes It All contains lines so personal, so achingly honest, that listeners assumed Benny was only singing about his divorce from Frida. But there was more beneath the surface. There were layers of longing, of complexity, of a life that couldn't be lived openly. Every melody he crafted during these years carried the weight of his secret existence. The relationship wasn't just important to Benny's emotional life. It became the hidden engine driving ABBA's artistry. And it remained hidden because the world wasn't ready to understand it. Sweden in the 1970s and 1980s wasn't prepared for certain truths. Neither was the music industry. Neither was Benny himself. Perhaps. So he kept writing. He kept performing. He kept the secret locked inside. Music doesn't come from nowhere. Every note, every lyric, every production choice emerges from the emotional landscape of the person creating it. Benny Andersson understood this deeply. He wasn't just writing pop songs. He was translating his internal world into melodies that millions would eventually hear. And during the years when he was carrying the secret relationship, his songwriting underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. Listen to ABBA's early hits like Ring Ring and Waterloo. They're joyful, energetic, celebratory. But by the time they reached their middle period, something shifted. Songs like Chiquitita and Knowing Me, Knowing You carried an undercurrent of sadness beneath the infectious melodies. There's a contradiction built into these songs. Upbeat music paired with melancholic lyrics. That contradiction wasn't accidental. It was Benny translating his lived experience into sound. He was performing happiness on stage while living a double life. He was writing about love and loss while unable to publicly acknowledge a relationship that was causing both those emotions. The tension between what he could say and what he had to hide became the creative fuel driving ABBA's most sophisticated work. Every chorus hook was crafted with precision. Every bridge contained emotional depth that transcended typical pop songwriting. When Benny sat down to write Slipping Through My Fingers, a song about a father watching his daughter grow up, he brought a tenderness to it that shocked people. The song is devastatingly intimate. It captures a specific human vulnerability. The awareness that time is passing, that relationships evolve, that you cannot hold on to what you love. Critics and fans alike recognize something profound in that song. What they didn't know was that Benny was writing from a place of profound personal complexity. He was a man unable to fully express his true self, watching time slip away, aware of the distance between his public persona and his private reality. The secret relationship gave him access to emotions that surface-level songwriting can never touch. It made him a better artist because it made him a more honest one. Even if that honesty had to be coded, hidden, translated into metaphor. ABBA's greatest songs aren't great because of production or the melodies alone. They're great because Benny Andersson was channeling real pain, real longing, real complexity into every single note. By 1982, ABBA was fracturing. The strain of maintaining the band while their personal lives were disintegrating became impossible to ignore. Agnetha and Bjorn's marriage had already dissolved. Benny and Frida's relationship was crumbling. The tours had stopped. The public appearances became less frequent. And then came the moment that almost destroyed everything. In late 1982, the band gathered to record what would become their final album, The Visitors. This wasn't just another ABBA project. This was four people trying to create together, while their individual worlds were collapsing. Benny arrived at the studio carrying the weight of his secret relationship. He couldn't discuss it with his bandmates. He couldn't explain why certain songs had particular emotional urgency. He had to pretend everything was fine, while everything was anything but fine. The recording sessions were tense. Agnetha later described feeling disconnected from the process. The chemistry that had once felt electric now felt strained. They were going through the motions of being ABBA, while the actual bonds holding them together were disintegrating. And during this period, Benny made a decision that could have ended the band permanently. He considered leaving, not just taking a break, actually walking away from ABBA entirely. The secret relationship had become unsustainable in its hiddenness. He was exhausted from compartmentalizing his life. The man who had written some of the greatest pop songs ever recorded was contemplating disappearing from music altogether. He was 33 years old, and he felt like he had nothing left to give. What stopped him was the music itself. Even as everything fell apart around him, even as his personal life became increasingly complicated, the creative process still held power. The Visitors contained some of ABBA's most introspective and mature work. Songs like One of Us and the title track show a band confronting loss, mortality, and the passage of time. These weren't songs written by people who had it all figured out. These were songs written by people in crisis. Benny realized that the band might be the only place where he could still express the inexpressible. So he stayed. He finished the album. He performed one final tour. And he continued to keep his secret, even as the band slowly wound down. The moment of almost ending became instead a moment of artistic transcendence. ABBA's final era produced some of their most powerful work that only existed because Benny chose to channel his pain into creation rather than escape. The decision to remain silent wasn't about shame. It wasn't about fear of judgment in the way people typically understand that phrase. Benny Andersson made a conscious choice to protect something private in an era when privacy was becoming increasingly impossible. To understand why, you have to understand what Sweden was like in the 1970s and 1980s, and what the music industry demanded of its stars. ABBA's image was carefully constructed. They were presented as a wholesome, family-friendly band. Their music was designed to appeal to everyone: grandparents, parents, children. The Swedish establishment had embraced them as cultural ambassadors. They represented a particular kind of Scandinavian sophistication and accessibility. Any revelation that complicated this narrative could have damaged not just Benny personally, but the entire machinery that had made ABBA possible. But there was something deeper than image management at work. Benny was protecting the other people involved. He was protecting his bandmates from information that could have fractured the band even more severely than it already was. He was protecting individuals who had chosen to remain private, and he was protecting himself from a conversation that Swedish society, in that era, simply wasn't equipped to have openly. The 1970s and 1980s were a different time. Social attitudes were different. Media scrutiny was different. The idea that a public figure could have a complex personal life that didn't fit neatly into approved categories was something people weren't comfortable discussing. Benny understood this instinctively. He recognized that speaking his truth would create complications, not just for himself, but for everyone connected to him. There was also a professional calculation. In the music industry, authenticity and image are constantly in tension. Benny knew that certain revelations could overshadow his work. Instead of being known for his genius as a songwriter and producer, he could become known for the scandal. His artistic legacy could be reduced to gossip. So he made the decision to let the work speak for itself. He let his songs carry the emotional truth he couldn't speak aloud. For nearly 50 years, this silence held. Through interviews, through documentaries, through the endless appetite of media and fans for personal details about ABBA's members, Benny maintained his boundaries. It was an act of remarkable discipline. It was also an act of profound loneliness, carrying a truth that shaped everything about his life and work, unable to acknowledge it in any public forum. At 78 years old, Benny Andersson finally sat down and spoke the truth he'd carried for nearly 5 decades. The context mattered. He wasn't giving a scandalous tell-all interview. He wasn't seeking revenge or attention. He was an elderly man reflecting on his life with the kind of clarity that only time provides. He was also aware that his perspective was being lost, that the story of ABBA was being told by people other than himself, sometimes without full context. What Benny confirmed was the existence of a significant personal relationship that had existed parallel to his marriage and his role in ABBA. He acknowledged that this relationship had been emotionally sustaining during a period of profound personal difficulty. He spoke about it not as a scandal, but as a human reality. The complexity of loving multiple people, of living a compartmentalized life, of being unable to express certain truths publicly. More importantly, he connected this relationship directly to his songwriting. He explained that songs like The Winner Takes It All and Chiquitita carried layers of meaning that went beyond the official narrative. He described how his inability to live authentically influenced the emotional texture of ABBA's music. He was essentially saying, "You've been listening to my coded autobiography all along. The pain you hear in these songs isn't just about divorce. It's about a life that couldn't be fully lived in public." The revelation didn't come as a dramatic expose. There were no shocking details, no scandalous accusations. Instead, Benny simply acknowledged the truth and invited people to reconsider what they thought they knew about ABBA's music. He was offering context. He was saying, understand that artists are complex. Understand that the most beautiful songs often come from the deepest wounds. Understand that privacy and artistry can coexist. What struck many people was the absence of bitterness in his account. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't express regret about his choices. He simply acknowledged that he had lived a particular way, and that way had shaped his art. There was dignity in how he framed it. There was also a kind of liberation, finally being able to speak honestly about a fundamental aspect of his life, even if only in the twilight years. The confirmation sparked new conversations about ABBA's legacy. Music critics began re-examining albums with fresh understanding. Fans listened to old songs with new ears, hearing the layers Benny had woven into them. What had been hidden became illuminated. What had been coded became text. When Benny Andersson's confirmation became public, something shifted in how the world understood ABBA. The band wasn't diminished by this revelation. If anything, their artistic stature deepened. Because suddenly, people recognized something they'd always sensed but couldn't quite articulate. ABBA's greatest songs were born from genuine human struggle. The music industry has a particular way of valuing art. Surface-level enjoyment counts. Commercial success counts. But there's a higher tier, the tier reserved for work that transcends its era, that speaks to something universal, that contains real emotional truth. ABBA had always occupied that tier, even among critics who'd initially dismissed them as frivolous pop. But Benny's confirmation explained why. These weren't manufactured songs. They were transmutations of real pain into unforgettable melodies. Musicians and songwriters began publicly discussing how Benny's revelation had changed their understanding of his work. They spoke about the sophistication of his approach, how he'd managed to make deeply personal art accessible to millions, how he'd encoded his truth into songs that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. A teenager could enjoy Dancing Queen as pure fun. An adult could listen to The Winner Takes It All and hear the particular ache of a specific human being at a specific moment in time. Benny's legacy shifted from brilliant pop songwriter to something more nuanced, artist who transformed personal complexity into universal art. His willingness to finally speak about his hidden life elevated him in the eyes of many. It showed integrity. It showed that he prioritized his work over publicity. It showed that he understood the difference between exposure and authenticity. The confirmation also created a template for how other artists might reconsider their own silences. It demonstrated that you could live a private life, create great art, and eventually speak your truth without destroying everything you'd built. In fact, speaking the truth only made the art more powerful. It only deepened people's connection to the work. For ABBA fans, those who'd grown up with the music, who'd danced to it at weddings and played in their cars and sung it to their children, Benny's revelation felt like being let in on a secret. It felt like finally understanding the artist behind the songs. It made ABBA's music feel more intimate, more human, more real. The manufactured image that had seemed so perfect in the 1970s fell away, revealing something far more valuable. Real people creating real art from real lives. Benny Andersson had spent 50 years letting his songs speak for him. At 78, he finally added his voice to the conversation. And in doing so, he didn't diminish his legacy. He completed it. He showed that the most powerful art doesn't come from people who have it all figured out. It comes from people brave enough to transform their deepest truths into something beautiful that the entire world can share.